The sermon this morning is called To Be Like Him. Now for Gibson and Haley, I always tell a joke before I begin a sermon this morning. So this is my joke for the day. Moses and Jesus were playing golf. And as they were approaching the first tee, Jesus told Moses, I've been practicing, done a lot of practicing. He said, I hit my drive now just like Tiger Woods. And Moses was really impressed. He said, that's good. So Jesus teed up the ball, and he hit it, and it went 100 yards right into the pond. Moses said, don't worry about it. I'll go get it for you, Jesus. You stay right there. So Moses walked down to the pond. He parted the waters and walked over there, picked up his ball and brought it back to Jesus and said, here, try again. So Jesus teed the ball up. He said, that was just really a practice. I hadn't really warmed up yet. So let me try again here. He said, this is the way Tiger Woods is. So he hit it and went another 100 yards and went right back in the same pond. And Moses beginning to get a little irritated. He said, that's all right, I'll go get the ball. You just stay right there. So Moses goes down there and parts the waters, walks out there and picks up his ball, and walks back and hands it to Jesus. And Jesus tees it back up again. Jesus said, well, this is the way Tiger really hits the ball. And he hit it about 100 yards right back into the pond again. And Moses said, I'm fed up with this. You go get your own ball if you want it. So Jesus walks down to the pond and starts walking out on the water looking for his ball. And one of the golfers on the other green over there yells over to Moses and said, who does that guy think he is, Jesus Christ? And Moses says, no, he thinks he's Tiger Woods. In 1977, there was a movie that came out that was called Oh God. Any of y'all remember that movie? Starred John Denver. Anybody? Come on. John Denver was a grocery store manager. And he was approached or visited by God. Now, who was God? Who played God in the movie? Anybody can remember that? George Burns. That's correct. God was portrayed as George Burns. So John Denver receives this letter that he'd been granted an audience with God. So he considered the whole thing just to be a hoax. But he goes to the designated meeting place anyway. It was an empty room except for a single chair. And in that room booms this voice of God. It's kind of booming and echoing. So John Denver asked God to show himself to him. Now I'm tired of this. Reluctantly, God appears before John Denver as George Burns. God stands there as an old man with thick glasses, baggy pants, tennis shoes, a windbreaker jacket, and a golf hat. And when John Denver just kind of stares at him, George Burns replies, well, what did you expect? Now, you might find that scene amusing. I did. Or you might even be a little bit offended by it. But I think there's something there that we can learn because it's very similar to what happened in Scripture this morning. As we read in Mark 6, 1 through 3, Jesus left there and went to his hometown. He was accompanied by his disciples. When the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were amazed. Where did the man get these things? They asked. What's this wisdom that's been given to him? What are these remarkable miracles that he has performed? Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son, the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. In this passage, God in the person of Jesus Christ stands before this group of men in the synagogue in Nazareth. You got to remember, Nazareth was his hometown. This is the small town where he grew up. Jesus had already gained a reputation in all of Judea. He had performed miracles like raising the dead, healing the sick, and calming the storm. He had taught large crowds. He was known throughout that whole area as the miracle-working rabbi. Then he comes home, and he teaches in the synagogue there. Maybe he teaches the same lessons that he taught in the other towns. But we just don't know the answer to that question. But the reaction in Nazareth was much different than what he got everywhere else. They raised the question, where did he learn to teach like this? This is just a carpenter who used to live right down the street. They just couldn't bring themselves to believe that this could be the Messiah that was mentioned in the Old Testament, because he was just a carpenter. And you can almost imagine Jesus asking the same question as George Burns. Well, what did you expect? Maybe they had a problem seeing God as a carpenter. Can you envision the great God of the universe in a workshop, knee-deep in wood shavings? The truth is, it's hard for us to picture Jesus as anything else but a powerful preacher. Now, we know that fathers in the first century were expected to teach their children the trade. Joseph, there's no doubt that Joseph taught Jesus all that he knew about carpentry. Now, we don't know anything else about Jesus between the ages of 12 and 30, but I think it's safe to say that he spent much of his time working in his father's carpenter shop. As you've heard me mention before, it seems very likely that Joseph died at a young age, and that Jesus, as the oldest son, may have been the major provider for the family. We do know for a fact that Jesus worked long enough at his trade to be known by the people of Nazareth as Jesus the carpenter. And in Mark 6:3, we find that people were offended by this because he was only a carpenter. God was a carpenter. And I think that there are several lessons that we can take by just knowing this fact. I want to begin this morning by looking at the distinction that we sometimes make between secular work and sacred work. Now, a question for you. Do you think Jesus was serving his heavenly Father as he worked in his father's carpenter shop? Planing doors, smoothing yokes? Or do you think he was just marking time until he could really begin to get out there and begin God's work? While he labored in his shop, was he engaged in secular work? Or was he serving God even then? I'm afraid I may have created an improper distinction between sacred and secular there. We usually think of secular work as work that has no spiritual meaning or religious context. And sacred work is work only that's spiritual in nature. It's probably easier for us to describe the differences in them than try to define them. Now, I would say that a minister's work is sacred, and a carpenter's work is secular. The first works for God, and the other just drives nails. So when a professor teaches a class in seminary, he's just doing secular work. But when he goes to church and teaches from the pulpit, then he's doing sacred work. The only problem with this distinction is that it's certainly not biblical. Do you think that God would agree with this distinction? I don't think that Jesus was serving God any more when he was preaching on the mountaintop than when he was working in his father's shop. The example that Jesus set for us was his complete service to the Father. In every context of his life, there was no secular work for him. Jesus was only involved in activities that were pleasing to the Father. When Jesus said to his mother in the temple at age 12, as we see in Luke 2:49, "Why are you searching for me?" he asked. "Don't you know I had to be in my Father's house?" Now, I do not think that he was just talking about that one day. I think this was a summary of his life's commitment. And what that means is that while Jesus labored conscientiously as a carpenter, he did also in obedience to God. Jesus did just not spend 18 years marking time until he really went to work for God. I don't believe that. He worked for him constantly. Suppose for a moment that we lived in that Galilean town of Nazareth in the very first century. You're a farmer, and one day while you were out plowing the field, the old yoke that you'd been using broke. So you decided you needed a new one made. So you go to the local carpenter shop. A young man named Jesus takes your order and tells you that your yoke will be made before the Sabbath day. Now, what type of yoke would you expect from Jesus? Do you suppose it would be top quality? Do you think that God, the carpenter, would take his work seriously? Now, I don't believe anybody ever brought back a piece of shoddy work that Christ did. He just did not work that way. He worked for God by working for the people. Our distinction between sacred and secular often causes us to see no connection between our religion and our employment. We may feel free to act any way on the job, but that may mean that we're not doing our very best. That we're not putting forth our best foot forward, as my dad would say. It may mean that we're acting like our coworkers. We're joking like they joke, and cursing like they curse. It might mean that we're engaging in slightly illegal or immoral activities. But when Sunday rolls around, it's time to serve God by going to church. But you see, we don't just serve God by going to church. We serve him by living for him in the very context of our everyday lives. Paul plainly tells us in serving our employer that we're serving God as well. Now, what he had to say was directed explicitly at servants of the first century, but it still has an application today, as we can see in Ephesians 6, verses 5 through 7, where it says, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and sincerity of heart, just as you obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly, as if you were serving the Lord, not people." Paul is saying that the Christian slave who worked in the fields or the vineyards was not just serving an earthly master. He was also serving God. And the attitude that we have toward our job changes when we realize that we're not just serving our earthly boss. Whenever we're serving God, it's not secular work. So then it must be a person's motivation or intention that decides whether he or she is serving God or just being secular. Think about that. You know, Jesus did the work of a servant when he washed his disciples' feet. This was a physical act. It involved a towel, a basin, some water, and some very dirty feet. All of this was physical, but it was also very sacred. So what made this act so holy? What made it sacred? It was the motive and the intention behind the physical work. That's what made it sacred. Now, thousands of servants washed the feet of their masters all over the area that night, without any of them being holy. But this particular act was holy because it was done for the glory of God in the service of others. When a preacher gets up and delivers a message from the Bible, is that sacred or holy? It is if it's done to the glory of God. It's also not very hard for a minister to be unholy. Paul spoke about this in Philippians when one of the men preached out of envy and strife. So if someone is preaching to bring glory to God, then that preaching is sacred. But on the other hand, if the person is preaching to bring glory to themselves, then that preaching becomes secular and unholy. Thus, in the same way, being a carpenter is sacred or secular, depending on the person's reasons for working as a carpenter. Paul said in Ephesians 4:28, anyone who has been stealing must steal no longer, but must work, do something useful with their own hands, that they may have something to share with those in need. If someone works to the glory of God by providing for his family, for the church, and for others who are less fortunate, then his work or her work is every bit as sacred as that of a minister. But if a person's goal is centered around money, prestige, and success, then they are as secular as they come. An editor of a newspaper once visited India. And while he was there, he met a missionary. It was a nurse who lived among the lepers and ministered to their needs. He noticed how tender and loving she was with those poor souls. Looking at her in amazement, he said, I wouldn't wash their feet or their wounds for $1 million. You know what she said? You know what her response was? She said, neither would I. But I'd gladly do it for my Savior. The only reward that I'm looking for is his smile of approval. But there's something else, though, that I want us to note this morning. The fact that Jesus worked as a carpenter is a reminder that Jesus came into the world in the most ordinary fashion, aside from the fact of the virgin birth. Now, he was born to two poor parents. As he grew, there seemed to be nothing special about him. He didn't walk around with a halo over his head. But as the prophet Isaiah predicted, chapter 53, verse 2, he grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him. Nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. In other words, there was nothing special about the way he looked. Jesus looked ordinary. He lived an ordinary life. And maybe this was the reason that the Jews in Nazareth couldn't imagine him as the Messiah, because he was just ordinary. There's nothing special about him. Now, I must admit that we live in a world that worships the grand, the great, and the outstanding. There's so little time for ordinary. So I can understand to some degree how these Jews felt. To be viewed as just average hurts our feelings. We all get hurt when we're called average. We would rather be up there with the indispensable people who are making their mark in the world. It's not just enough for us to say we have dreams. We want that great dream. We want to win the lottery. We want the big house with all the land around us. But as I look around us this morning, as small as we are here today, I can see enthusiasm and energy that's usually only found in the very young. I can see Christians who are on fire for their church. I see great men and women who seem to know the Bible, who can probably quote more Bible verses from memory than I can. But we can end up with the impression that we're not on par or gifted with those evangelists, teachers, and leaders who we consider great. After all, our lives seem so ordinary in comparison to theirs. There's no hysteria, and there's nothing special about his life. So I go back to what I said earlier. Did he serve God during all those years? You better believe it. He did it while performing just ordinary, everyday tasks, like each one of us. Now do it by our gifted preachers. And there's so many who fulfill their responsibilities in the shadows. But they're just as important as the gifted ones that I admire. I have just as much admiration, though, for a mother and father who raises their children to know and love God. We all need to refuse to be intimidated into thinking that ordinary is only a little more than useless. We need to thank God for the enthusiasm of ministers and leaders who are so gifted. We need to thank God for the dedication of missionaries who travel around the world under the most difficult circumstances. But I don't want us to ever get the feeling that we're anything less just because we're not serving God like them. After all, we work in ordinary jobs like teaching school, balancing books, selling products, or performing other needed services in our community. I don't want anyone to feel that they are not and cannot serve God doing this. In the case of the minister or missionary, are they serving God any more than the rest of us? Remember, what counts is Christian service. And that comes with a period. Now I want you to think about this. Does it count that you raise your children to believe in God and to fill society with the richness of the love of Christ? Does it matter that you work among the lost and are showing them a Christian example of honesty, integrity, and purity? Does it count that you set forth the principles of Christ in your marriage and in other relationships? These are the kind of things that are just as important as anything a minister does or says. Is it wrong for us to downgrade our own service to Christ or to God just because of the work that we do compared to the preacher who works for the church? If we're working to glorify God, then there's nothing ordinary about anything that any of us does. What raises ordinariness to significance is dedication of who we are and what we stand for. And I'll repeat that again. This is key. What raises ordinariness to significance is the dedication of who we are and what we stand for. I remember my mom telling me when I was a teenager dating, as I get ready to go out the door, she'll remember this. She'll say, remember who you are and what you stand for. She said that every time I left that door to go out on a date. And if we're serving Christ in this way, then we're not ordinary, but we are extraordinary. Now here's one more thing I want to touch on this morning. The fact that Jesus came into this world as a human being with all its frailties and even worked an ordinary job for a time tells me something about God's love for each one of us. Now here's a story that Paul Harvey told, and you maybe even heard it on the radio before. It's called The Man and the Birds. Now the man, Paul tells us, was not a Scrooge. He was a kind, decent, and mostly good man. He was generous to his family and upright in his dealings with other people. But he just didn't believe in all that incarnation stuff which churches proclaim at Christmas time. It just didn't make sense to him, and he was too honest to pretend otherwise. He could just not swallow the Jesus story about God coming to earth as a man. I'm truly sorry to distress you, he told his wife, but I'm not going to go to church this Christmas Eve. He said he would feel like a hypocrite. He said that he had much rather stay home and wait for them. So he stayed home as they went to the midnight Christmas Eve service. Shortly after the family drove away in the car to go into the church, snow began to fall. He went to the window and watched as the flurries were getting heavier and heavier. Then he went back to his fireside chair and he began to read the newspaper. A few minutes later, he was startled by a thudding sound. It was sort of a thump or a thud. At first, he thought it must be somebody throwing snowballs against his living room window. But then he went to the front door to investigate the source of the sound and found a flock of birds huddled against the snow against the house. They had been caught in a storm and were desperate for shelter. Then they had tried to fly through his large plate glass window. Well, he couldn't let the poor birds just lie there and freeze, so he remembered that they had a whole barn that the children's pony used. He thought it would provide a warm shelter for them if he could just direct the birds to it. Quickly, he put on his coat, and he trampled through the deepening snow toward the barn. He opened the doors wide, and he turned on the light. But the birds just wouldn't come in. He figured some food would get them in, so he hurried back to the house, and he got some bread, and he tore it up on top of the snow, making a trail to the wide open doorway of the barn. But to his surprise, the birds ignored the bread and continued to flap around helplessly in the snow. He then tried to catch them. He also tried shooing them in the barn by hurting them and waving his arms. Instead, they scattered in every direction except into the warm barn. And then he realized that they were afraid of him. To them, he reasoned, he was a strange and terrifying creature. If there was just some way to let them know that they could trust me tonight, he thought. I must let them know that I'm not trying to hurt them, but just trying to help them. But how? There just seemed to be nothing that he could do where they would follow him in the old barn. They were not going to be led or shooed because they were afraid of him. If I were only a bird, he thought to himself, I could mingle with them and speak their language. Then I could tell them not to be afraid. And then I could show them a way to safe and warm. And he paused. To the safe and warm barn. But I would have to become one of them so they could see and hear and understand. And at that very moment, the church bells began ringing. Now, this was just a story or a parable, but I think it illustrates why Jesus became a man, why he worked an ordinary job and lived in an ordinary house in an ordinary town. It was only because of his willingness to be like us that we have the opportunity to be like